and I'll try not to just leave the difficult ones to to the side. All right, I'm going to try to answer the most of the questions as I possibly can. I've tried to organise them into kind of categories in a way, in that short time that we've had. And so I'm going to begin with sort of a category that I've just put together of these questions, which I'll read out mainly together. There's one question here that says, how does allowing same-sex marriage encourage a breakdown of commitment to relationships and family? And a related question, do you have any examples, historical or current, that can demonstrate how homosexual marriage will have a causal negative effect on heterosexual marriage, or negative effects on children? Okay, so those two kind of went together, I think. Hopefully you would agree. And I'll try and answer them now as best I can. And feel free to, feel free to respond during my answers. I might just have to cut each question short so I can do justice to all of the questions as best I can. Okay, so that's second question. It's a good question. Do we have any examples, any empirical evidence for any of this, basically, that changing the definition of marriage, allowing same-sex marriage, would actually be negative for society? And as far as I know, there's no empirical evidence that I would point to for this. But the thing about this is that, well, not something you say in science, is an absence of evidence is not an evidence of absence. And so, for instance, if there was a reason to presume that you wouldn't have evidence for something, and in this case I would say, given the short amount of time that the very few countries in which same-sex marriage is already allowed, given how short the time has been, and given how hard it is to collect data to do with all of these questions, and how many different variables all contribute to all of these factors to do with the health of marriage and the health of children raised in marriages and in families, it's very hard to expect there to be clear empirical evidence that would say, look, this happened here, same-sex marriage was allowed, and then as a result, this happened, a degradation of marriage or family. It's the sort of evidence that we can't expect to find, even if it's true. Okay, so that's my first answer, is that we're not actually basing this on empirical evidence, because the empirical evidence here is, firstly, there's not enough time to have gathered it, and secondly, there's too many complicated factors to expect to be able to gather any sort of trends or anything at such a short, early period of this radical social change, really. But then, the related question, if marriage is, the first question, how does allowing same-sex marriage encourage a breakdown of commitment to relationships and family? If there's no empirical evidence for it, in other words, why do we believe that this will happen? And again, my answer to this, as I touched on in the talk, is that if we change the definition of marriage, okay, so if we take the male-female aspect of marriage out of the equation, if we decide as a society that the reason we have marriage is simply for adults to love and commit to each other, if we decide as a society that marriage and procreation are not actually linked, and that's essentially what the decision will be if we change the definition of marriage. It will be a decision that legally enshrines that understanding of marriage, that it's only about the love and commitment between adults, that you have marriage going on over here for people that want to commit to each other, adults that want to commit to each other, and there's procreation happening over here for people that want to procreate. But there's no connection between the two. That's essentially what would be decided if we change the definition of marriage, and that's why, for instance, the Australian Marriage Equality website puts that argument forward, that there is no link between the two. So if we change the definition of marriage to decide that marriage and procreation are no longer linked, that there is no essential link, then what this will do, I believe, is that for young people growing up in the future, and we know that this is already happening, that there's this culture of the temporary, the hookup culture, the knockout culture as I called it, the culture of the temporary, as Pope Francis put it more eloquently. Now, what we're looking for here as the institution of marriage is for young people to be educated with this. The law and the education and this whole raft of social approaches, soft social pressure you can call it, for young people to realise that as they grow up and as they consider having children, that they would realise that it's important for them first to consider a permanent, committed relationship to the person who they think will be the right parent for their children. It's the kind of attitude that used to be so obvious in our society until pretty much the sexual revolution. And then gradually, as I said, sex without commitment, sex without responsibility, sex without the consequence of children, if you like, began to happen since around the 60s. And gradually there has been this obscuring of the link between commitment and children. And so, in essence, this is a theoretical conclusion that I've drawn, but I think it's so logical that we can agree that to make this decision will flow into these consequences. And of course, we could, if we wanted to, decide that we'll just go with it and do a bit of a social experiment, see where the evidence leads us. But we don't really want to do that because, of course, it would mean that there would be some people that are being involved in this experiment, the vulnerable people, the future children of our generations, of our society. And we don't want to just include them in a social experiment and then make that the way that we're going to decide this question. We have to make this decision here and now based on the best logic, the best reason that we have available. And so there is, in a sense, the empirical evidence that we have before us of a degradation of the stability and permanence of marriage relationships already, or of male-female relationships already happening. This is the evidence that we see. That when we look around us, increasingly impermanent family structures, increasingly children not being able to form those stable relationships with both parents. And so I think there's enough evidence to see that our society needs a strong marriage culture. A marriage culture which would involve, as I say, education, a marriage culture which will involve a strong definition of why marriage exists, a strong definition of marriage being something that young people who are considering procreation should be moving towards and working towards. It's something that we can very much take for granted as something that we grow up with. A lot of you, I'm sure, would think that, maybe you'll grow up and you'll settle down and you'll have kids. But if you think after a number of generations, when we've further obscured this connection between marriage and kids, that there'll be even less reason for people to think about looking beyond the hookup culture, looking for that permanent partner, who will be not only their life partner, but also the parent of their children. So, does that go some way to answer it? If society should strive towards more permanent relationships, should divorce be abolished? That's one question. Another question, it's well and good to say that in keeping marriage between men and women, it will cultivate an environment of commitment which will aid the children's upbringing. But what if in a situation of marriage between a man and a woman, the relationship deteriorates to one of abuse and or adultery? How can you justify that? So those two questions again go together. I think follow on from what you just said, which is that it is placing a lot of pressure on this idea of getting marriage right. Now, of course, when it comes to individual marriages, there are instances where divorce may be allowable, may be the best thing, especially in the case of abuse. Okay, we don't expect that a man and a woman would usually have to stay with an abusive husband. Separation, at least, would be not only allowable but encouraged in the case of abuse. Okay, but that, again, it's an exception to the rule. We can't make legislation something that applies to every single case that you can imagine. Legislation is something that applies to generalities. That's the purpose of the law. And so when it comes to these specific cases, of course, there are exceptions to the rules, but does that mean then that we as a society don't want to promote the health of marriages, that we don't want to promote permanence of marriages? For instance, and this is something that it's not just about this. It's not just about this question of same-sex marriage. It's about a whole raft of approaches that we should be implementing as a society. Marriage preparation, marriage counselling, marriage building workshops, all of these things that as a society I believe should be promoting. We should be promoting, giving people the skills they need to be able to live lasting, healthy marriages in many ways. And what I'm saying is that one of those ways is to keep clear in all of our minds as a society why marriage exists, especially for those who are being educated in the schools, that they realise that it's not just this commitment between adults, but it is something that they should be considering, especially when they go into their sexual relationships with the opposite sex and potentially will be bringing children into the world. that they be realising that this is more than just about fun for themselves, this is about the potential children that they'll be bringing into the world as well through those relationships. And the culture of marriage, kind of this expectation that, you know, marriage and kids go together, which still exists to a degree, but is starting to be weakened. But if we can maintain that and even recover that kind of a culture, I think a little bit more deeply, then that will, I believe, help to promote that idea of young people especially entering into and moving towards permanent relationships, just realising the value of it and striving for it in general. Now, there was a connected question here. Yeah, a few connected questions here I've got all together. Why do you need a wedding and this official term marriage to commit yourselves to each other? Why can't you just promise yourself to each other for the rest of your lives? And this is a good question. This is the sort of question that I guess I would be asking opponents of my position. I would say that when it comes to the institution of marriage, as I said, the reason that I believe it exists as a public institution, not just a private contract that people enter into between themselves to start their personal relationship, but a public institution that the government is involved in, is, as I said, I believe because the government has this interest and society as a whole has an interest in promoting permanence amongst the procreative population. Okay, so then you have these couples that do exist that are same-sex couples, and they are not part of what I would call the procreative population. There's a difference here because, for instance, if you had, say for instance that, you know, there were people hooking up here tonight, all right, and they're going to go home, they take a partner home. If they're a heterosexual couple, then there's a chance that they'll bring a child into the world in their sexual encounter. If they're a same-sex couple, there's no chance that will happen. Okay, so that's the fundamental distinction that exists between same-sex couples and opposite-sex couples. It's almost too obvious to even state, but it is the fundamental distinction. When people say, you know, it's all the same, love is all the same, there is a very important distinction between these two kinds of relationships. And that's the distinction that this is based on. This is why the government isn't interested in promoting permanence and stability amongst, say, the gay community. And there are actually gay people, people from the LGBT community who are arguing against same-sex marriage because they say, why does the government want to promote monogamy in our community? They say that they've been trying for years and decades to make it clear that they don't have to be monogamous, to make it clear that there's nothing morally superior to monogamy compared with, say, you know, a free sexual revolution kind of more promiscuous lifestyle. And they say that, and it makes sense. It's true. Why the government isn't making a moral judgment here on people. The government is saying, we're interested in promoting permanence and stability in the kind of relationship that will bring children into the world for the sake of the children. And so that's why the government isn't interested in creating this institution of marriage for same-sex relationships. Okay, but that doesn't mean that same-sex couples can't commit to each other in whatever way they choose. They can make a life commitment to each other, and they can get all their friends and family together, and they can make this life commitment in whatever way they choose. But it won't be called marriage. It's a different thing from the institution of marriage and from why marriage exists in our society. Any responses to that? Try how long we've got, firstly. Yeah. What time do I have to finish? Oh, close. Good. It's a good response. What time do I have to finish? 15 minutes. Okay. All right. No immediate objections. I'll leave them. Civil unions. If a traditional definition of marriage should be maintained, why should the church or anyone else be opposed to same-sex civil unions? Someone asked. Now, I won't go too deeply into that because I'm not too clear on that, actually, and I think the church itself is still discussing this question, okay? If some form of alternative union, something other than marriage, in order to, for instance, protect the legal rights of children that are in these alternative family arrangements. They may well be possible, may well be even allowed and approved of by the church, possibly. It's not yet decided by the church, so I won't make any definitive decision myself. But clearly, the key point in my talk is that as long as we're keeping marriage as the fullness of why it exists in our society, being the male-female union, as soon as we take that away from the definition of marriage, we're obscuring the fullest purpose of marriage, and that's the harmful thing. That's the thing that will harm our social environments, our human ecology, as Pope Francis put it. If a marriage is about being procreative and creating stability for the next generations, how does that apply to married couples who can't have children? Very important question. Thank you for asking that one. As I touched on in the little imaginary marriage between myself and a random person called Jennifer, but the definition of marriage does not include fertility, cannot include fertility, because that's a condition that can't be certain of at the time of contracting the marriage. Marriage must be an unconditional bond, and so fertility is not going to be and never will be a part of the definition of marriage. And what this means is that for a man and a woman to make the ultimate commitment to each other in our society, whether they're fertile or not, for them to make the ultimate commitment to each other means to get married, because their relationship falls within the definition of marriage. And so if they didn't get married, they'd be wondering, oh, why doesn't he want to marry me? Why doesn't he want to make the ultimate commitment to me? Why doesn't she want to make the ultimate commitment to me? Different for same-sex couples, because their definition, their relationship is not within that definition that we've chosen as a society for civil marriage. So for them to make the ultimate commitment to each other will be another form other than marriage. Okay, so what this means is that for couples, any male-female couple that decides to make the ultimate commitment to each other, they will get married. That's the ultimate commitment for a male-female couple. That's the definition of marriage that falls within, that relationship falls within. And in no way are we saying that their marriage or their commitment is any lesser than a procreative relationship, a procreative marriage. An infertile marriage is just as much an expression of love and commitment for life as is a fertile marriage. So when I say a marriage is about being procreative, creating stability for the next generation, I'm not saying that every marriage is about this. I'm not saying every marriage has to bring children into the world and create stability for those children. I'm saying the institution of marriage, the reason it exists as a civil institution in our society, is to create this culture, this social environment, this human ecology, where people are encouraged towards commitment, where they realise that marriage is something that they should be looking towards if they're thinking about bringing children into the world. Does that make a bit of sense? Any questions or objections to that? Two, good. Yep.
So, what I was, sorry. Okay, so we're talking about marriage, and we're talking about marriage being one that reinforces commitment, and then from that, obviously we have to be open to life and things like that, which is fantastic. And that's the ideal is for a person to get married, be committed, be loving, enforce an environment of healthy, bringing up healthy children and so on and so on. And so that's the ideal, but that's not what we have. And so and what we don't have is so we've got marriage, and we have adultery, and we have abuse, and we have Catholics themselves, breaking this ideal of marriage. And so what needs to be done with that? And so whereas a gay couple would have a healthy marriage, I guess a healthy view, maybe mentally a bit more stable, decided, you know what, I don't want to be like them, I really want to focus on my children, I really want to focus on this relationship, then like what's healthier, like and so what's going on there. How is the Catholic Church looking to work on that? If the very people, the very Catholics aren't actually keeping this ideal of marriage alive.
Right.
Yeah, I think I understand the question, and I think it's a good point to make that there is always going to be the ideal that we're striving for and striving to help people to achieve. And there will also always be the reality, which is always going to be less than the ideal. That's definitely true. And I guess I would say part of the answer is that that's the whole reality of the church, that we're a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints, as someone said. And we recognise our weaknesses. We try to help each other through our weaknesses. But at the same time, I think it's important that we don't simply say that let's let go of the ideal. It's unattainable. And there are a lot of young people these days who are thinking that way because they look around them and they see all the marriage breakdown, all of the problems with marriages, and they say, well, why even try? It's not going to work, And that's what I think we want to combat again in this this next step in our human ecology, our social environment. One of the steps I think we need to be taking is to remind young people, encourage young people, equip young people, with the various skills that we can give, and let them know that there is a possibility of lasting and happy marriages. It's something that can happen. It does happen. We have some beautiful examples of it in this room here today, and that the fact that it's not always attained doesn't mean that the ideal no longer exists or has a meaning for our society. And in fact, holding on to the ideal is all the more important. And having faithful witnesses living the ideal is all the more important in our society than it was ever before. We're part of the way there. That's a room. And there's a question over there as well.
So we're talking about setting good role models here for hetero couples, but can we not open the institution of marriage to allow same-sex attracted people to have the same role models for good, loving couples?
Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. So you're saying that, I guess you're saying part of the role of marriage is to have role models of love and commitment for others, I guess partly saying, I guess my response to that would be that, again, like I mentioned before, that the gay community itself, they would question, I guess, why monogamy, why permanence is to be valued above non-monogamous lifestyles. They would question that, and obviously there would be moral issues that would come into that and different moral opinions, but from a civil point of view, from the government's point of view, they don't want to make a moral judgment on this. They don't want to say, look, we need to elevate monogamous, lasting, committed relationships as role models to the rest of your community. That's not the government's role here. What the government wants to say is that lasting monogamous relationships are important for our society in the procreative kind of relationship, the male-female relationship. That's actually important for society as a whole, as I said, because that's the kind of relationship that brings children into the world and we want stability for the children. So what I'm saying is, I guess, and it's underlying this whole thing is that as we decide, which of those four roads we're going to take that I mentioned, there's a cost-benefit kind of analysis, I guess, that we want to make. And so what would be the benefit of allowing same-sex couples to marry? It would mean, firstly, that we're changing the definition of marriage, and as I said, further obscuring that link between marriage and procreation. And